Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about basically a couple concepts, but it's going to start with the idea of metabolism. So first off, what is metabolism? Metabolism has to do with the making and using of energy. And so today, to do that, we're going to talk about two major systems. We're going to talk about photosynthesis, which a lot of people correctly identified as something that happens in autotrophs or plants. And we're also going to talk about cellular respiration, which is something that happens in animals and anything that uses up energy. So the goals for today, we want to know what metabolism is. Basically, the big idea is how is energy used. That's going to be our theme for this lecture. We want to talk about what is photosynthesis, basically what are the steps, what do we get in and out of it, and we'll do the same thing for cellular respiration as well. So first off, I want to talk a little bit about the cyclicalness of this nature. So the idea is that mitochondria, which is an organelle that's found in things like animals, and chloroplast, which is an organelle, or a small organ, that's found in cells of plants, work together. So basically, there's a cycle where they're both providing something for each other. And this is all part of the idea of metabolism, of how energy is stored and used. So first, the chloroplasts, they're able to use energy from the sun. The energy that they're able to use comes from the sun, and so it's a light-dependent process. And from that, they're able to make something called glucose, a sugar that's used by the mitochondria. So now we're going to cover the steps of photosynthesis. There's basically two main cycles. There's the light-dependent, meaning it needs the light, and we'll talk about that one first, but there's also the light-independent. So what happens in light-independent? Basically, in the cell, there's the chloroplast, which was our green molecule. And in the chloroplast, if we zoom in and were to look at it even closer, we'd find these molecules called chlorophyll. They look kind of like channels. And in chlorophyll, what happens is energy from the sun activates them. And that energy from the sun is converted from the sun's energy into a temporary energy storage. And we'll store that energy temporarily so that we can use it later, but the goal is eventually to put it into glucose. But for right now, we've temporarily stored the energy from the sun. And basically that's the goal of the light-dependent cycle. We're taking energy from the sun, using that in chlorophyll, and saving it later for glucose. Now we're in step 2. What have we gained from step 1? We basically have energy stored in electrons. So our electrons are holding our energy. So what do we want to do with that energy? We want to go into step 2, which was our light independent, meaning no light is needed. So we've already got our energy and we've stored it. So we've got no light needed. Instead, we're going to do something called carbon fixing. And this is also known as the Calvin cycle. So what happens now? So what happens now in the Calvin cycle is we're going to take the energy. So here's our energy from our electrons. We're going to use that energy to turn a cycle. And in that cycle, what we're going to do is we're going to take carbon dioxide from the air, CO2, and we're basically going to glue CO2 together. And when we glue CO2 together, we're going to kick out oxygen. So that's one of our products. And we're going to result with something called a bunch of carbons together. So when we put all those carbons together, we end up with 6 carbons. And that 6-carbon molecule is called glucose, which we learned about last week. And the cool thing about glucose is we can use it as a monosaccharide. But eventually we can store it as a polysaccharide. And that's why a lot of plant products, such as potatoes, taste really starchy and plain. And that's something we'll investigate later this week. But the idea is we have a polysaccharide, which is storage. So now we just want to make sure we summarize photosynthesis. You go ahead and take a shot at it, but for me, when I think of photosynthesis, we take energy from the sun, plus carbon dioxide, plus water, and we're trying to make glucose. Oxygen's just a side product. So how do we do that? We have two steps. We have the energy step, which we get it from the light dependent stage, where we use energy from the sun to make that. This is also where we use the water, where we get the electrons from. So water was our source of electrons. So then what happens in the second step? The second step was our light independent phase, where eventually we're going to put glucose together, and that's from the carbon dioxide. So basically that's what happens in the process called photosynthesis. So now that we've covered photosynthesis, it's now time to talk about cellular respiration. So earlier, a lot of people talked about cellular respiration, and they thought it had to do with breathing of a cell. And while that's not exactly true, cellular respiration has to do with making ATP from glucose. It does make sense because we do need to use oxygen, which is where the respiration comes from. So cellular respiration, what do we need? Well, we need glucose, and we need oxygen. So that's where the breathing comes from. So you remember, oxygen was our gas, and glucose was our sugar. So how do we turn this stuff into something usable? There's basically 3 steps. And what are those 3 steps? Our first step is glycolysis. Our second step is the citric acid cycle, also in some textbooks known as the Krebs cycle. And lastly, our third step is the electron transport chain. So let's break it down and talk about what that means. Glycolysis, break that word down. Lysis means break, actually. So we're breaking down glucose. So we take glucose, our 6-sided sugar, our 6-carbon molecule, and we want to break it. And what do we get? 6C divided by 2. You end up with 3 carbons. So we end up with a molecule that we end up calling pyruvate, a 3-carbon molecule, which then is able to go into the mitochondria. So what is a mitochondria again? You might remember from earlier that the mitochondria is the organelle. And that looks like this. It's the powerhouse of the cell, and it's found in both plants and animals. So now it's able to go inside the mitochondria. So now on to step 2, we're looking at the citric acid cycle. And just like before, when we wanted to make the electrons as a temporary storage, we want to make a temporary storage here. So in goes our 3-carbon, our pyruvate, and it's going to kick out a bunch of things. The first one being FADH2. It's also going to kick out something called NADH. So what are these things? Both of these things act as a temporary energy storage. So this energy is not the currency we want. It'd be kind of like turning these things into Canadian money or euros. It's not what we're looking for. We're looking for money. We're looking for ATP, and this just isn't the right money yet, so we have to convert it. And that'll happen later. But basically, the citric acid cycle, we're generating a lot of these in hopes that eventually we can get to this, which we'll get to in our last step, the electron transport chain. So here's our last step, the electron transport chain. Imagine this is our cell membrane. And this could be any type of membrane, whether it's in the mitochondria or any form. But the idea is that we're being able to pump protons. And how do we pump protons? We're going to pump the protons using up the FADH2 and the NADH from the previous step. So FADH2 and NADH create a proton gradient. A proton gradient. So what does that mean? It means there's a lot of protons on one side and not a lot on the other. So you can kind of think of this like going to the mall. There's a ton of people on one part of the mall because they're all trying to get the latest and greatest toy, the Xbox One, for example, or back in the day when Wii's were popular. They're all trying to get that one item, so they're all on the other side. So we have lots of protons on this side, lots and lots and lots, and none on this side. So how do we get them to equal out, right? We're trying to get everything to equal out. This special enzyme called ATP synthase. And ATP synthase kind of acts as a motor that's going to rotate. And as it rotates, the protons are going to drop back out. So what's this like in real life? You can think of it in real life like a windmill. And as the wind turns the windmill, we generate energy. The same thing is happening here, but instead of wind turning it, we have these protons pumping it. And as the protons go around, we're making ATP, which is the goal of what we want. So, how many ATP do we end up with? We end up with anywhere from 34 to 38 ATPs. So why is this so important? Because we've created, going back, a gradient converts energy to usable ATP. Think of this way. ATP is like dynamite. ATP, it's dynamite. That's what we're trying to get to. So now that we've got the ATP, we've completed out cellular respiration. Of course, it's always good to summarize. So why don't you take a moment and go ahead and summarize what you learned about cellular respiration, and I'll take a moment to do the same. So cellular respiration, what were the big ideas? We are using glucose to make ATP, and there are, again, 3 steps to doing that to make the ATP. The first one, glycolysis, we're breaking sugar. Step 2 was the citric acid cycle. And the goal of that was to make FADH2 and NADH. And glycolysis, what it made was a 3-carbon compound. Lastly, we went through the electron transport chain, and from there is where we made the ATP. So that's basically what happens in cellular respiration. It also makes sure you remember it happens in the mitochondria. So to wrap us up and to summarize all of what we did, so photosynthesis and cellular respiration. What did we learn? Photosynthesis makes the glucose and makes the oxygen. It uses CO2, water, and sunlight. In contrast, what does cellular respiration do? Cellular respiration uses glucose and oxygen, and to do that, it makes CO2, water, and ATP. These are 2 important steps when thinking about metabolism. We're going to cover this a little bit more in depth in class, but the idea is to just get an overview of how photosynthesis and cellular respiration work. Remember, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email or message me, text me. I'd love to answer your questions. But hopefully you learned a lot about energy and how energy works. Have a great day.